Today we are looking at the poems are being studied in grade 12 in English, first additional language. This is in fact the second part of a series of presentations. In the previous series, which was broadcast on Friday, we did the poems Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds, Death Be Not Proud, An Elementary School Classroom in a Slum, Auto-Wreck, and of course Milton on His Blindness. Today we are tackling the second group of 5 poems. I am Timothy of Tapelong. What is poetry? All right, poetry is painting a word picture. Poetry creates mental images through the use of figurative language, creative diction, rhyme, and meter. Okay, most good poetry relies on being heard, not only being read. In that aspect, in that regard, it is similar to music. Music has words, music has a tune, music has rhythm. Poetry, good poetry to my mind, is very much like that. Aspects of poetry to consider. Here I've given you some background questions to ask. Who is the poet? Often, if you know a little bit about the poet, it will tell you more or less what to expect in his poem. Then, when was the poem written? Obviously, Shakespeare's poetry will be very different to that of the poetry written in the 20th or 21st century. In diction and grammar and every aspect will be completely different. Shakespeare, of course, never wrote, for example, a poem called Auto-Wreck, because in those days there were no cars, so it wouldn't have been possible. And then finally, why was it written? Always, in order for a poem to be written, there must be a motivating factor. So always we look for the story behind the story. Here we've got some tips on poetry analysis. The theme is, of course, the message or the deeper meaning of the poem. And then the question that I always ask my guys when we deal with theme, what have you learned from it? It's not what I have learned, it's not what the textbook says, it's what you have learned from it. The form is, of course, the structure of the poem, the number of stanzas, if any. Some poems are a single stanza. The lines per stanza, the use of enjambment or run-on lines, and is there a refrain, a chorus? Then diction, the choice of words. Archaic, for example, is words that are no longer used, common in Shakespeare and John Donne and Milton and those guys. Slang is informal words and phrases used by a specific group of people, and jargon is, of course, specialized words and phrases. The tone of the poem. Is the mood or atmosphere of the poem, well, friendly, sharp, sarcastic, ironic, angry, humorous, condescending, etc.? We go on to rhyme, which depends on sound, not spelling. The rhythm affects the flow or the pace of the poem. It is affected by sound devices and the meter, that is the stressed and unstressed syllables of a line. And then, of course, here at the bottom here, you've got imagery, the combination of literal and figurative language used to create the pictures in the mind. Poetry is about forming your own pictures in your mind from the sounds that are coming in through your ears. And before we look at aspects, I'd like to read through the poem with you. Okay, we're tackling A Prayer for My Countrymen by Guy Butler. So let us start by looking at this poem, and then we're going to do something slightly different and also run through, after this, some figurative language. A lot of understanding poetry relies on being able to convert figurative language into literal language. So if we could spend not too long, I'd say 10 minutes or so, just looking at converting a figurative language into literal language, it will help you enormously in understanding poems. It's the same tricks that we use in summarizing. Summaries, of course, do not contain figurative language or examples, So we do exercises converting figurative language into literal language and condensing it. However, before we go on, let's look at this poem, which is, to my mind, very moving, not least because this poet, Guy Butler, was a friend of one of my closest friends, who was also in those days a lecturer at Rhodes University down there in Grahamstown. To this day, one of the finest universities in South Africa, and I'm paying them a tremendous compliment because I can classify them in the same fantastic quality as I classify the University of the Free State. Good, let's read through this poem together. This is A Prayer for All My Countrymen by Guy Butler. Though now few eyes can see beyond this tragic time's complexities, dear God, ordain such deeds be done, such words be said, that men will praise your image yet, when all these terrors and hates are dead. Through rotting days, beaten, broken, some stayed pure, others learnt how to grin and endure, and here and there a heart stayed warm, a head grew clear. It's short, it's simple, it's very to the point. And it is such a deep and moving personal commentary here being made by Guy Butler, who, like me, witnessed a lot of the problems caused by apartheid all those many years ago. And even though Guy Butler has long since died, and my friend who knew him has long since died, we are here to carry on his memory, and this poem will remain forever in literature as a commentary done by him on that period in South African history. Now, let's see if I can navigate my maze, my way through this maze. And there we have a few comments that I have made about this poem. This is by no means exhaustive analysis. You have been taught this poem already, and I'm sure your teachers are perfectly competent. Let's just look at what I have got out of this. Firstly, Guy Butler was a white English South African liberal who was, of course, a professor at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, and he did not support the government of the day. Very few of the liberals did. And of course, the poem was written during the apartheid era of South Africa, which must have been very horrifying to Guy Butler, who was an intelligent man and he could see what was going wrong. And of course, there, the very obvious thing, why was it written? The poet is expressing his disapproval of the apartheid system. He does not describe it in a positive light. But looking slightly more deeply at this, here, the theme, even in times of apparent hopelessness, people survive and look to the future. People have this amazing ability to survive even under the worst conditions. You can look at, for example, countries that are recovering after a war. During World War II, or after World War II, the aftermath in World War II, Germany had been bombed into nothingness. Most of the cities were either damaged or destroyed. Even in Berlin, which was bombed possibly more than any of the other places, still, people were living there. They made a plan to get water. They made a plan to get food. They carried on. They were still there. And this is this poem comments on that. I must stress that, of course, this is my take on the theme of this poem. You may have a completely different outlook. We are both correct, not just me. The form is, of course, 3 stanzas, but you'll see no formal structure, and there is extensive use of enjambment. Only one full stop occurs in the entire poem, and that is right at the end. Okay? Then we move on to the diction. You will see I've commented there, it is religious words appropriate for a prayer. Words such as ordain. Obviously, that has religious allusions there. When God ordains things, or people are ordained into a specific role in a church. Then the tone. I do not regard this poem as cheerful. I've put it there, the antonym of cheerful, one of the antonyms, is of course gloomy. But here we are given some hope. The poem is not entirely without hope, especially in the final stanza, in the last few lines of that, when he says, others learn to grin and endure, etc., etc. We'll go back to that. We'll look at the poem in a bit more detail after this. Moving on here, there is, of course, almost no rhyme in here. 2 words do in fact rhyme, that is pure and endure, but I think that was accidental. I think that this was not written as a formally structured poem with rhyme, and there's a reason for that. Because we look at the rhythm. The poem is slightly hesitant. You notice that? It doesn't flow along and along and along. It's sort of jerky almost. And it gives the impression of a sincere and unprepared prayer being offered to God. You know, in a church, and this is appropriate, so I'm going to mention this. In some churches, they will use a fixed order of service with a prayer book, which will tell you how to pray. In other churches, they don't. And the prayers that are offered up are sincere prayers from the heart, and whether they come out clearly or not, well, they are real life prayers. So this to me is an example of the latter, where it's a prayer from the heart. The narrator is begging for God's assistance in this regard. Now, we have here also the imagery, and the 2 most powerful images in this poem, to me, are those 2 phrases, the tragic time. Time is not normally described as tragic. Well, of course, also, I think he did that deliberately in order to introduce this really clever alliteration. Tragic time. Tragic is sad. It is when an accident unfolds which could have been prevented. And really, that choice is so accurate when describing the apartheid system created by Verwoerd. It was a descent into a dark pit which need never have taken place. But it did take place. We must accept that history is littered with examples of failed political experiments, and apartheid was no more or less than a sad example of that. And then we have that second one, rotting days. Very metaphorical. Days, of course, cannot rot. Days are units of time involving just over 24 hours. You cannot describe a day as rotting, and yet he does, because the imagery that it conjures up is very strong indeed. Let's go back then and look at a few other aspects of this poem. Let me see if my recent lessons in electronic manipulation are accurate. There we go. Please take a look at that. So we start in the beginning where he says, though now few eyes can see beyond this tragic time's complexities. So already this is conditional. He says there are so few people who are able to see into the future beyond this terrible time that has been created in the country. And then he speaks directly to God and he asks that, ordain that such deeds be done. What deed? What deed? Go back to your first section there. To see beyond this tragic time's complexities. That is the deed for which he is asking. That we can look into a brighter future. That such deeds be done, such words be said. What words be said? Once again, looking into that purer, brighter future. And why? Then he motivates it. And he says, if this is done, that this brighter and better future arrives in our country, that men will praise your image yet. I get a bit worried when he puts the word image in there, right? One of the most important of the 10 Commandments is that you must not bow down before any image. God is God without images. Please note that. But having said that, he goes on to say, but at least he's got it right, that people will praise God. All right? For when all these terrors and hates are dead, they must go away. The terrors and the hatred. And of course, they cannot literally die. What he's doing here is using some rather clever personification. He's giving the terrors and the hates human qualities. They cannot die, but people can. So here, a slight bit of personification. And he goes on to say, here's that wonderful expression, through rotting days. Rotting days. You know, one of the jokes I made in the last broadcast was to show you an advert for the House of Carrion, the perfumes made by the House of Carrion. Carrion is in fact dead and putrefying flesh, the dictionary definition. I took it down. So that reminds me so much of this poem. Dead and putrefying days. Putrefying. It's rotting and it stinks. You can actually get this image of the days are a bad odor in the nostrils. Beaten, broken. Okay, talking about the violence used to maintain the apartheid system. Some stayed pure. Some were not corrupted. A very subtle allusion to the Bible, that when Elijah is praying to God, that God takes him off the earth, and God says, I have reserved unto myself, I think it was 900, who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So yes, always, God reserves to himself a number who are sealed to stay his faithful servants. Others learned, it says here, how to grin and endure. You grin and bear it. That famous saying, things could be worse. Things could be a lot worse. Always. At least if we've got food in our stomachs, clothes on our backs, and a roof over our head, we can't complain too loudly. It could be worse. Then, and here and there, a heart stayed warm. Why does he say a heart stayed warm? The heart is, of course, the center of emotions, in this case being used metaphorically. And the heart did not get corrupted by the hatred of the time. And there was a lot of hatred of the time. And then he goes on to say, a head grew clear. People started to see beyond the deception and the lies that were being told. Whenever a government seeks to build up a bad system and to maintain that specific government in power, They use propaganda. They spread lies. But these things always eventually get exposed as lies, especially today when any one of us can pick up a phone and Google anything that we want to. We can see live footage of things happening. It's becoming more and more difficult to lie. But in those days, the government had tight control over the media, and the media basically consisted of radio and TV. However, some people began to see through the lies that were being spread. I am Timothy of Tapelong, and I hope that you're going to stay close to your IBP broadcast equipment, because there are many, many brilliant lessons still to come. Don't forget that when you are studying for paper 2, you can do just that. You can study. It is one of the easiest papers in which to increase your marks with some self-discipline and going through your notes as much as you can. I really hope that you will do that in both September and in the final exams in November. Goodbye, everybody.